a lot of times I find community where certain things go unsaid because we all understand what's going on. So in particular, I'm thinking about Sunday school at the Islamic Center, and it's a bunch of young 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, brown boys who look just like me. A lot of things go unsaid. We all know what life is like as a young Muslim boy. So we know that we don't like the police. None of us like we don't like it when they come around. We don't like it when they come show up and ask questions at the Islamics. Like, that's a contrast to who I played basketball with as a elementary school student, because their parents were police officers and they trusted the government and they trusted. So finding yourself as a minority in these spaces is different, because I can't ever tell them that I don't trust the police or I don't like their parents. How am I going to do that? So community alters in that aspect, where I feel like maybe as a brown boy, I was hiding certain parts of myself because it was easier for me to live in that way.
Writing has been really important to me over the past 6 or 7 years. I think that's been a way to really connect with all my communities, whether that be people who are currently living in Afghanistan, diaspora, the South Asian diaspora, friends I met along the way. We've been able to write to each other, maybe not physically in the form of letters, but in acknowledging one another in books and stories, and voicing the things that we've been feeling and emoting. And so I think for me, there was an experience in the first time I went back to Afghanistan, and I remembered it was in 5th grade, and my Paxio then was awful. It was so bad, and I was so embarrassed. And so when I came back, I was like, I'm gonna learn this language, even though it's super hard. And I really tried, and it's still not the best. But I think that experience of just realizing the power of language, and in the purest form of just communication across people who are really important to you but you still can't talk to, and also in like the way it's permanent and the way that language lasts for so long, I think had a really huge impact on me. And so I think that like reconnection to Afghanistan and like that relearning of Paxio was really, really instrumental in like any form of poetry I entered into later on in life. I found a lot of community in the South Asian poetry space, and just leaning on each other has been really incredible. And I think that there's a lot of shared experiences with a lot of oppressed countries. And I think that impact on how we define ourselves, how we grew up, how the markers of our poetry, whether like lots of fruit, for example, in all of ours, I think has been a really wonderful thing to step into.
I did find solace in having a bigger South Asian community and a bigger Muslim community, but then I also started to experience intra-ethnic, what I would call intra-ethnic racism, that people from other faiths with my same background of being South Asian were trying to distance themselves from me because of my Muslimness, or they had tried to distance themselves from me because of my faith. And that was also a very jarring experience, because being the only one of my background, I mean, like, man, I wish there were others like me. And then coming here and being very hopeful and happy with the new people I've met, but also experiencing racism from not only non-South Asians, but from South Asians themselves was very heartbreaking. And it was a bit of a wake-up call for me.
I don't know. I think there also is something to say about, I don't know, South Asian family systems, Tamil family systems, and how it's very like, and especially, you know, for my family, because we experienced trauma post 9/11, it's very like, you keep to yourself, you don't really like, we don't mix and mingle with like anyone. Like it was very isolating in a lot of ways.
When I came into undergrad, my purpose or extracurriculars were to, be the representation for the Muslim community, be the representation for Muslim women and hijabis in a lot of white dominated spaces. And so I was a part of student government, and I learned very quickly that just because I felt like I was doing a lot for my community by representing, it didn't mean that they also cared, as in like student government and a lot of these white spaces. And so I quickly, it took me 2 years, 1.5 years to realize that. And so I moved away from that, and I decided to come back to what I viewed was my community. And I had to look into my identity. What identity is most prominent? What identity do I notice the most in myself? And that was being a South Asian woman, a woman of color, a Muslim woman, and kind of just a lot of that overlap. And so I joined Disha, which was a student group for non-binary femmes and women from South Asia. And not only did that it fulfill my purpose, it also created like long-lasting relationships. As an undergrad graduate, I still have maintained some of those relationships in those orgs, because I think when you work together, friendship also blossoms, and I'm very grateful for those relationships. And so right now, my current community and the people I keep close to me are women of color, multicultural women, South Asian women. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm sure that'll change, broaden, narrow in the future, but I think that's where I feel the most satisfied in my support system.
Like the Bay and Punjab, like I feel, and Punjab is like something that's I have a very intimate relationship with, so that's like a whole different story. But definitely in the Bay Area, like, when I grew up, like, I was born into a Punjabi family, so I never felt like, oh, nobody looks like me, or there's nobody like me. Like, I was born into a family and there was cousins everywhere. Like Bay Area has like one of the biggest Sikh populations, and even like, most of the kids I grew up with, like I went to primarily, Black and brown schools. Like I was never really in like an environment where it was like just white people or anything that was really alienating. So I think that's why I had such a strong connection to it. And then, of course there weren't those like, it was just so different from, that whole Rajasthan environment where like a lot of people, so like you kind of need to seek approval in that, world, because I was going to a boarding school there, and it was a boarding school that, is a very quote unquote prestigious place, but you had to win a lot of approval from, the caste like, there's a lot of casteism at that school. There was a lot of, prioritization to the local Rajput caste, which is the upper ruling caste of that state. So, there were a lot of opportunities that, you had to kind of fight for if you were not from that category.
What I abide by is this word in Urdu, which is yakjehti, which means unity. I think, and what I think I differ, and my generation differs from, as South Asian Americans, as the rising generation of South Asian Americans, compared to our older generations, is that we understand and we see and we empathize and we help our fellow brothers and sisters of color, our fellow marginalized individuals, our fellow a marginalized kin in America, realizing that their story is one that also deserves empowerment. Too often we see that, for instance, like racism is very common in South Asian communities. In for instance, just it's so hard, like if you have like uncles and aunts sitting in front of you that are 30-40 years older than you, trying to teach them about why it's so imperative that we support the Black movement, for why we support the Black Lives Matter movement. To an extent, it reminds me of the fact that we really need to be united as marginalized identities in an imperialistic state. When we draw divisions within ourselves, it only lets the aggressor get to us even more. If we look at history, we see the policy of divide and rule in the British Empire, where the British came in, and the way that they were able to make so many great advances within the continent, seized control of the entire population was that they created inner divisions within the population. They pitted Muslims against Hindus, Muslims against Sikhs, just an endless array of division. And when we as marginalized, and when we as a marginalized South Asian population kind of do this within ourselves, when we do this not only with our fellow brethren of color, but rather just even within ourselves as a South Asian community, we're not only kind of like disbanding the very thing that our ancestors resisted against, we're enabling the American imperialist state, we're enabling the American system to persecute and to oppress our fellow brethren of color. And I think the responsibility to even have conversations about accountability as a marginalized identity, to answer specifically that question, revolves on even recognizing the inner racism and the inner hatred that we have, despite being a marginalized identity, towards other marginalized identity, and in that way directly and indirectly enabling the imperialist state.
Because of like different histories of migration within South Asia, whether it be partition or whether it be various civil wars and various conflicts that have happened in the region over the past century, there's a lot of, I think, a lot of unspoken mental health needs across South Asian communities in the United States. And so, like taking care of our communities and in whatever way that may be. But for some reason, like mental health is really coming up a lot in my mind right now, just because I think there's a lot of stigma and shame in South Asian American communities very broadly. Not speaking about that, but considering some of the experiences that, whether it be like a friend's grandparents who experienced partition in India and Pakistan have gone through, or whether it be, there's just so many like traumatic events that have happened in that region. And I think like centering like emotional healing and mental health and mental well-being is really important, and it's often not discussed in our communities. So that's coming to mind.
And then again, just practicing principles that we kind of brought from home and then forgot when we came here, right? Like there's like a thing among our friend group, like Venmo is not allowed. Like we'll be fighting at the Indian restaurants to like pay for because we're like, this is what we were taught, and we're taught these things are wrong. Like, no, that's bad, that's embarrassing, you shouldn't do that, right? But no, what the heck? Like we were taught this, and this is natural to us. It's instinctive to us. It feels very weird to ask somebody, Venmo me for a freaking samosa. Like that, it just feels wrong to us. We can't do that, right? And even then, like just doing those small things for somebody, like paying for something. I know, very, very capitalist, but just like paying for something, you're alleviating them of having to put in time into something they don't want to do, right? Working to make the money to pay for that thing, to do something else, something that they really like to do. Talk to somebody they really want to talk to, make some art that they really want to make, practice a hobby, listen to like Rihanna, or a really enjoyable activity like that.
I mean, just notice how we all show up like as our aunties or as elders in our bodies when we interact with each other, whether that's, cooking and I'm like, oh, add this spice, or like taste it this way, or so-and-so used to always do this, so I think we should do that. Or dancing in the kitchen, and just that sort of levity and that comfort that we all find in kitchens, and how that's really rooted to our understandings of our histories and our understandings of our lineage. But also like, and what's so cool to me is that we're creating something new at the same time, like every time we cook together, it's different. Every time we think about what it means to be in queer community with like queer ancestors that we know existed, but we don't necessarily know intimate details of or know of, like knowing that they existed sometimes is enough,